today we're really fortunate to have Paige Ware with us. And I know a lot about Paige from the internet already, looking at her CV. And I was going to show you, hopefully after this talk you'll go and visit her website. But she finished in 2003 at Berkeley, got her Ph.D. In, what's the field?
Language literacy and culture.
Language literacy and culture, under the direction of Claire Cronch, I guess. And since 2003, you'll have to scroll for yourself, scroll through her CV, but she's been publishing like a true dynamo. And the most important thing, I think, that's actually not on her CV that she wanted me to mention is she's the PI of a Department of Education grant that she just won for the next 5 years to the tune of $1.5 million, $1.5 million, and which will be providing ESL certification to secondary teachers. So maybe she can talk to us a little bit about that. And she's also a recent recipient of a TESOL International Research Foundation grant, also called TURF, in this world of acronyms, $20,000 comparison study with Robert O'Dowd to examine peer feedback on language, focus on form. But the real reason I wanted Paige to come talk to us today is because most of the talks that we've had, or up until now, have been focused on foreign language learning in the college context. And Paige is going to do something a little bit different because obviously technology is it's bigger than that. And so today we're going to change our focus a little bit to secondary education, which is a good thing, and also get away from the foreign language, and it'll be an ESL context. So we're still talking about language technology, but kind of broadening the horizon a little bit. So please help me welcome Paige Ware.
To cut extra hard. So thank you, Carl, for the introduction. Like you said, this talk will be somewhat of a departure from the previous three talks in that we're focusing on secondary ESL. But just as you cannot take the country out of the girl, and in this case, I was a transplant from rural Kentucky to Dallas, you can't take the foreign language lens out of the researcher. So what you'll see here hopefully will ring familiar in that I come from a foreign language background and have been working in secondary ESL for the last 4 years because I'm housed in a school of education and because Texas is just a splendid place to be taking your language lens to the secondary schools. What ultimately I'll be arguing in this talk, one of the main points, is that we need more language specialists in the secondary field. We have a lot of literacy specialists, but especially in the push with technology, we're going to need to see more people coming in with a linguistic background and even a foreign language lens. So welcome. Hopefully I can excite you about some of the exciting things going on. Like to give you an overview of the talk since we've already been somewhat truncated in our time. Most of the bulk of our time we'll spend in what I'm calling a conventional frame of looking at technology and language learning in the schools. But before that, for those of you who perhaps haven't spent any time with your hands on texts written by adolescent learners, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some examples from students in a middle school project that I ran last year. And then finally, we will look a little bit at the digital frame, and this is a really exciting area for a lot of people. Multimodality is being explored. New literacy studies falls under this frame. I'm not going to look particularly at research projects for want of time, but I'll give you a splash into what some of these multimedia and multimodal texts and practices look like in the secondary schools right now, and then I'll tie everything up. So. Gabrielle is a student. We're going to look at two students, Gabrielle and Sylvia, and we'll look at them throughout this talk. So we'll keep coming back to them as examples when we start looking more at the theory and the research. But Gabrielle came to the U.S. 2 years before this project and was placed in ESL 2, which basically means low intermediate learning. And he wrote this to an online mentor in a project. Hi, my spring break was boring because I didn't do anything, just sat staring at the wall, because I was punished, because I hit my brother, because he was running in the house, and that's why I hit my brother. So, just if you want to see what I just said, that might help a little bit. But this is an example of a student who did not have a lot of formal literacy in his first language when he came to the United States, and he's struggling quite a bit with translating what he hears in English into written English. On the other hand, we have, in the same exact classroom, taking the same schedule of classes, Sylvia, who also has been in the U.S. at this time for 2 years. who comes across much more fluent as a typical adolescent who likes basketball, who has visions of herself as being a teacher someday. I'll give you a second to read that. I like the 2 lines. I think I'm pretty, but I'm not sure about that. And when I get mad, it's thanks to a boy. They're both native Spanish speakers, yes. Actually, all of the students in this study were, all of them. So from a linguistic perspective, we can look at several things. For Gabriel, we see some first language phonological transfer in very basic ways. In Spanish, the letters I and the letters Y represent the E sound. So when he wants to talk about his brother, he writes he. And when he wants to talk about the word my, he takes that diphthong in English and separates it into vowel sounds, my, which makes sense. So if you were grounded in that, you would be able to recognize that and provide support. At a similar level, we might consider him something of an ear learner. Now, this is absolutely dumbing down Reed's breakdown of ear learners and eye learners. But in a nutshell, we see that he is learning English through hearing it and then trying to transpose that onto what he does with writing. And we see that not only at the phonological level, but also with how he encodes what he says. Cause for because, and for and the dropped morphological endings, which tend to get washed out in spoken English. Sylvia, on the other hand, has some L1 literacy transfer. We see it at a much more sophisticated level with multisyllabic words, where she spells some of the multisyllabic words with the Spanish spelling, including the single P instead of the double P, and languages spelled like lengua in Spanish. And in her syntactical structure, occasionally slips into her first language literacy. She drops the it, and it is, when I get mad, it is because of a boy. And so we see also that her oral development is influencing her second language literacy. There's not much subordination here. There's a lot of repetition in her written language. Not atypical for a lot of adolescent second language learners and regular language students as well. Now, from a secondary education perspective, this is to try to place us a little bit more in the audience that I'm intending here, which is secondary education teachers and the need for specialists in language here. Typically, staff developments within districts do a pretty good job of trying to bring their content area teachers, math, science, social studies, in regular classrooms up to speed with some basic principles in ESL, because they're having such changes in the demographics of their classroom. So they have to do kind of a stopgap measure. So teachers are learning things like the strongest predictor of second language learning is the amount of formal schooling. In the case of Gabriel, it makes his teachers maybe feel that there's quite a road ahead, since he did not come with that kind of schooling. I+1, Krashen's input +1, is still pretty dominant. And I've found that with my teachers, it's a pretty useful heuristic for them, makes them feel comfortable that, okay, I need to challenge my students. And yet, coming from a foreign language perspective, it seems to me that they're not really as well grounded in second language acquisition theory or even in analyzing student language to understand truly what input means, and then just how much is that +1. So I find while this is useful in helping them challenge their students, it doesn't do a whole lot at the actual level of improving the language itself. And finally, they're learning things like the BICS and CALP distinction. Even though those of us in foreign language have come a lot further in the research field in this area, this again is a useful heuristic for teachers to say, hey, you know, if it's not necessarily that we're not doing our jobs if our students aren't learning English to perform well academically on TAKS within 2 or 3 years. That shouldn't happen for quite a while. It makes kind of a disjunct between what's happening when they're asked to take TAKS after 2 or 3 years, but that's for another talk. So again, from a secondary perspective, just to hammer home that point about BICS and CALP, this is Sylvia's writing within the same 2-week period when she wrote a social message and when she wrote an academic book summary. So even in the book summary, you see the same types of repetitive talk, the same types of limited subordination, even more misspellings here. So this is what teachers right now in secondary schools are learning, that just because their students maybe sound like they're ready for more challenging academic work, they still need a lot of that linguistic support. But just how to deliver that support is one of the big questions. And in this particular talk, we're going to amplify that question by throwing technology into the loop. So in terms of technology perspectives, we're going to look at 2 frames. The first is a conventional frame. And in his talk at ILA a couple of years ago, Mark Warschauer talked about this as a learning frame. And he and I subsequently published on that, just came out in the Handbook of New Literacies in 2008. And in this frame, technologies are seen as an evolution of former technologies. You had radio, then film, then television, and now a computer. And so it's just, how can this technology help us do what we're already doing better? How can it enhance learning, and how can it do it in a much more cost-effective way? So most of the studies done with the conventional framework are larger scale and quantitative because they're focused on policy, they're focused on practical outcomes, on trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. In the digital frame, we broke this down into two, but for the purposes of this particular talk, I'll just gloss over the first. The change framework is where we find a lot of work in new literacy studies and multimodality. A lot of this work is taking place outside of school settings. Not surprisingly, because most of the time it's very difficult for teachers to implement these new technologies like blogs and wikis and fan fiction and manga and anime in their classrooms. So most of the work is being done outside of school settings. The object of critique here is the school itself, in that schools are not being seen as keeping pace with the rest of the 21st century world and how we're moving forward both in the workplace as well as in social spheres, and that students are being cheated out of what needs to be a better type of education for them. So it's more of a radical view than the learning framework. Also within the digital frame, we house the power framework. This shares with the change framework that literacies are actually revolutionary, and that we need to be looking at all kinds of literacies, not just traditional conventional literacies. But unlike the learning framework, this frame argues that we have to do this in a way that serves social justice. We have to look at linguistic context, social context, socioeconomic context. We cannot simply run our studies and say it works or it does not work. And hopefully I'll be able to show you some research evidence why this is the case, that we have to move up one level from the learning framework. From a practical perspective, we find that 8 years ago, gosh, it's 2008, 8 years ago, 63% of all classrooms that were used for instruction in secondary schools had internet access. Now this number has obviously increased because it had doubled from the previous 2 years before that. However, 80% of public school teachers self-rate themselves as not being well prepared to teach with technology. 4 out of 5. And this is not surprising, considering that only 6% of the budget spent on technology, only the technology budget, not the budget in general, but the technology budget, is spent on professional development. The rest goes to hardware, software, and maintenance. So we find a very different picture than perhaps what we find in foreign languages, where we tend to do research in post-secondary settings. So within the conventional frame, the types of questions asked are the fundamental one that Larry Cuban has been writing about since the 80s. Are computers being used in schools? Well, he argued back in the 80s, not really, they're in the closet, coining the term computers in the closet. He came out in 2001 with a book called Oversold and Underused, again critiquing schools for spending all of this money on technology but not actually finding ways to integrate it in useful ways in the classroom. He's not the only one who's been writing about this, though. So other people have looked at when computers are used, what's the impact, and you'll see that these findings aren't always helpful. So then we look a little bit more closely and say, well, when they're used in particular ways, what is the impact? This is where quantitative is starting to drive in a direction of saying we need to situate our work. For example, when computers are used, one of the largest studies is PISA, and they did a subset of this international research on 15-year-olds, and in their special subset of about 175,000 students, that's quite a big subset, they found that there was a negative correlation on reading and writing scores when students had home computers, but when students had home computers with internet access, there was a positive correlation. So it's not the computer then that we're talking about, but it's a wired computer. And that's why when we talk in the digital frame, we'll talk more about ICT, information and communication technologies. People are turning more to that term because that term is the one that includes this idea you have to be networked in order for this. School use of computers had this very ambiguous finding in that when teachers used computers some of the time, there was a positive correlation with achievement scores. But when they use the computers a substantial amount of time, there is a negative correlation, ambiguous. So we have to look then at when computers are used in particular ways. So one of the other major studies done in this was on 1,000 fourth graders in Maine in laptop schools where each student had a laptop computer to use at home and at school. I know Dwyer and his colleagues found that there was a positive correlation when they used computers for editing papers in more traditional vein, but a negative correlation with reading and writing scores when they made multimedia presentations. Now, there is probably a two-part explanation for this. On the one hand, not surprising if you've stepped into schools and seen how multimedia presentations are used in very mechanical ways. On the other hand, we also have this problem that the conventional frame is still relying on the same paradigm of standardized testing to try to measure the things that we would like to capture in these broader ICT literacies of the 21st century within the digital frame. So when we weigh in on the conventional at this broader level, we see that they do try to look at educational access and equity, but they do so without having a situated lens. They do provide assessments of larger trends, which is positive in that a lot of the research coming out of the digital frame is isolated on small pockets of students, either self-motivated students or highly motivated researchers who are out there in the field working with people on a daily basis and not taking into consideration all of the various variables that come into play in secondary school settings. However, this is often very ambiguous, so maybe it points back to the need to start with some of these smaller populations. And finally, the conventional frame is probably the easiest way to slide technology into schools in that this is where teachers feel most comfortable because these are the frames they're used to. Whether or not that's the way we want to proceed is a separate question, but given that 80% are already self-describing as not comfortable using technology, you would hate to rewrite their whole pedagogical approach and their uses of technology all at once. It might be hard to get teacher buy-in. So we're going to focus in on the conventional with two small projects. The first is based on software programs, which have been used for drill and kill practice. They've been used as reading management systems. They've been used in remedial programs. And they've been used in this particular thing called automated writing evaluation, which was supposed to be something very spectacular to help writing teachers alleviate the burden of grading all those papers. And then we'll look at a form of telecollaboration in a very different way. In asynchronous discussion boards, we set up an online mentoring project, which was also intended to be mutually beneficial in the same way that telecollaboration is, except that instead of having post-secondary students writing in their two languages, you had pre-service and in-service teachers mentoring middle school ESL students in these asynchronous forums so that the middle school students' writing could improve and the teacher's ability to work with students using that new technologies could improve under the mentorship of a professor. And I think you'll see when we look more specifically at that why that mentorship is important. So with automated writing evaluation, very briefly, these are fully self-standing programs in which students can submit an essay and they can get a holistic score, 1 through 6, on how good their essay was. And then 5 minutes later after they revise it, they can submit it again and get another score. And so supposedly it really motivates students because they want to raise that score. It also has functions such as providing very in-depth feedback on particular grammatical issues so that students can self-teach themselves how to learn about these errors and develop their metalinguistic awareness. Now, there have been no ESL specialists or language specialists on the development boards, and I think you'll see the ramifications of that in this slide. So the student's text is written in black. And when they clicked on, I want some feedback on my mechanical errors, they got 11 errors flagged. 6 of these are different types of errors. So even for a native speaker of a language, getting this kind of information on your writing might be a bit of an overload. If you're 13 years old and barely keeping up with your English, this might be a little bit more difficult. Now, what you can also do is click on an individual link that gives you even more explanation about what missing articles might be, and you can read up on that. And this is the page you would get for a single error. You would get a metalinguistic explanation, you would get examples, you would get layman's person explanations, you would get essentially a full text that could be pretty daunting. So one of the promises of this type of software is pretty high, but when you actually look closely at the functions, it fails to deliver at the same level. Doesn't mean it's bad, and we'll look quickly at the results of a study, but it does mean that ESL students are not using these functions. Proponents of this type of writing evaluation software say that it should motivate students to write more. But what Mark Warschauer and his graduate student Douglas Grimes found is that even though they revised more, almost all of the revisions were just at the basic syntax level, the lexical level. Similar to findings we found in foreign language education, it's very difficult to get students to go back and revise at the organizational level, or at the level that people who write professionally or professional purposes tend to think is the best way to revise. Also, the proponents said this should save grading time, that students can write more. And indeed, it saves a lot of grading time, but it doesn't create more hours in the day. And so students ended up writing the same amount. Teachers saved time, but they weren't assigning more writing because they still only have the students for the same number of hours in the day. Critics, on the other hand, worried that might replace writing teachers. Far from it. Instead, teachers were able to do what they do best even more. So teachers who had over 100 students a day had more time to conference with students, to plan the future lessons, to look for patterns in the feedback themselves, because there's an output function in the software programs. Critics also worry that this might have a negative effect on teaching. So if you happen to come from a process approach to writing, hey, maybe using this 5-paragraph essay software is going to push you into a rigid mold. Also far from the truth. Teachers taught the way they normally teach, which can be both positive and negative. If your beliefs and practices inform what you do over then the technology, it's nice that technology doesn't have that determinism, but it's also sometimes worrisome because you can override maybe some not so good pedagogical practices and still do what you've always done, even with the benefit of these new technologies. And they worried that it might promote stilted writing because all of the prompts and the grading system were pre-programmed. So all of the prompts were 5-paragraph essay prompts. Hence, there was this worry students are only going to write 5-paragraph essays, but there was little evidence of that impacted from the actual writing program. It was more a result of the overall pressure of these statewide writing exams. So turning then to asynchronous discussion boards. This was a forum that tried to do exactly the opposite of the automated writing forum. Instead of using technology as a self-standing program to motivate students to write, we brought students in a mentoring relationship to motivate them through social aspects of writing. And set it up for an academic year. Each week the students wrote. There were 22 students involved. They were matched one-on-one with either a pre-service or an in-service teacher. They wrote on a combination of assigned tasks and personal writing. We collected data on the students through 4-timed essays to see if there would be improvement in their fluency and accuracy scores. And on the teacher's end, we had them write action papers reflecting on what they learned as teachers about the process of being involved in this. In terms of the students, we found it was pretty positive for a pilot study. There was an increase across the board. 21 out of 22 students had a positive increase in their fluency overall. There was a pretty dramatic increase, and there was a 50% reduction of the errors in spelling that they made. It was quite difficult to code for an interesting project for a graduate student or even me, but it's difficult to code things like T units with these students who are still learning their punctuation. So you have to infer the punctuation. Won't get into that level of detail here. Sylvia, back to her, really engaged with this project, spent a lot of time. They had 45 minutes to log on, read their message, and write their message. She spent a lot of time coloring, creating different font styles, adding clip art, finding images off of the internet. And a lot of people are really impressed by how savvy she is with the technology and that she can actually do this. And I will argue a little bit later, I see it as a bit of a smoke screen. It doesn't take that long to learn how to insert clip art, and I feel that this sometimes is a way of students impressing us or impressing teachers who aren't as familiar with technology, when in fact they're actually crying out for help. I need help because I can't do other things with the technology. Gabrielle, on the other hand, took 45 minutes to write this message. And a few weeks later, took 45 minutes when he had to attach a picture. I want to send you a picture of a white tiger because I like them and they're cool. I saw them on television, and then I want to send you another picture. So we see from Gabrielle that he's perhaps not really getting as much out of the social aspect of this as Sylvia did. And in one of his later emails, I'm going to see your PowerPoint later because my laptop is not working. So when we talk about technology kind of helping teachers, it actually increases their burden. This teacher had 21 students. Some of the computers were never going to work on a particular day. So she always had to have a backup plan. She was always double planning her time for the students. The mentors at the beginning, we made assumptions about them as well. They're in the conventional frame. They should be able to provide feedback on student writing. We're not asking them to do multimodality. We're not asking wikis. We're not asking blogs. We're saying write to a partner. And yet this is what we got. Platitudes. So it's really difficult for the teachers not to step into teacher talk. And not only not to step into teacher talk, but not to do so in a way that was completely not useful to a 12-year-old student. A, it takes them a long time to decipher this, but B, you need work on your grammar and punctuation. Of course I do. But why and what and how? And other teachers on the other side had a bit of overkill in which they gave a lot of information about how you might correct those grammatical errors. So we have preposition overkill here. And prepositions are one of the last things you want to antagonize your students with because it's one of the last things that students learn in a foreign language or a second language. So fortunately, these messages were at the beginning of the semester, and because they were being mentored themselves by their instructor, towards the end of the semester, it was a much different. They basically helped to reestablish a different kind of footing with the students. But some of the students were completely turned off by this kind of relationship and just stopped being as engaged. Other students would accept the turn and spirit of the email exchange and continue to write fluently. So when we weigh in on the conventional again, but this time having looked more specifically at some studies, it's a little bit harder to break these down into pro and con. We have on the one side that, as we talked about, if your prior beliefs influence how you use technology, that could be seen as useful because technology isn't determining what you do. But if your prior beliefs are saying you need to give detailed feedback on prepositions, then maybe using technology can help you revisit that. So maybe it's not so beneficial that it doesn't impose some kind of different thinking onto what you do. So transferring some of what we do in our tried and true practices isn't always optimal. It isn't always optimal to say, let's start with the pedagogy and go from there. Sometimes we need to look outside of schools and say, here's what's happening in non-pedagogical contexts. How can we bring that in a new way into the schools? Teachers are encouraged to use new technologies but aren't provided with support. And software programs exist. Teachers don't have to recreate their own materials, which is important. We stepped into the media lab here, and it's incredible the number of resources going into making these multimedia programs for students. But a teacher has to plan 5 or 6 classes a day, so it's an onerous task to expect that she or he could create new materials every time there's a new technology to pull into play. So we're going to turn briefly to the digital frame. And this is a really exciting frame, and I think you'll see why. And probably many of you have read some of the literature in this area, if not all of it. What's important to keep in mind, the thread here that we're going to look at is even though we're trying to situate what's happening with technology in schools, we're finding time and again that there is this digital divide. Not so in the amount of access or the numbers of computers that people have, but in terms of how these computers are being used. And so we're going to see that threaded through. The typical research questions I've divided into 3 categories. On the one hand, they're trying to look at what are the new technologies outside of schools. And here you have work by a number of scholars looking at Japanese anime and manga, looking at blogging, wikis, chat rooms, digital storytelling, fan fiction, multilingual communities online, video gaming by James G. There's a lot going on here. Some of it is focused on ESL learners, particularly the work by Eva Lam and Rebecca Black with fan fiction and multilingual communities. The work that I've done with digital storytelling has been focused on ESL students as well. And some of it is just more broadly construed within a new literacy studies perspective and is not yet anchored in any kind of second language learner population. In the second overarching question, we look at the new types of literacies that are taking place inside of schools. And this is an area that I particularly find fascinating because it's growing so rapidly right now. In 2000, in the Handbook of Reading Research, basically, it was found that very few studies had been done specifically on internet and communication technologies inside of schools. Now, of course, there had been some, but few. After that, however, we've seen an absolute surge. Most of the studies done are done on things like internet searching, how to search, how to critique, how to evaluate, how to use the internet. Mark Warschauer did probably the most comprehensive study so far on new literacies in schools with his Laptops and Literacy book, in which he documents the use of laptop programs in multiple districts and looks across classrooms at how these computers are being used. And finally, the third overarching question that frames this particular view on technology and language is, again, looking at the social, the economic, the cultural, and the linguistic contexts, and how that impacts students' access to and their use of the technology. So an example of this research is a comparison that was done by Attewell and I think in this case Winston, and they looked at how technology would be used in low SES and high SES homes, and found, unfortunately, very clear patterns emerging, as you can see on the board, some of which are much more inclined to prepare students for academic work, and others which are not. This was called a Sesame Street effect, in which an intervention that's intended to help people who might not come with the same academic advantage are provided with some help for doing that. But in being provided that, it's open to everyone. And so students who might start further below in the academic preparation are going to become better prepared, but so are students who are already prepared, going to learn from that as well. So there's the Sesame Street effect, which has been found in comparisons of technology use in high and low SES schools again and again. And now we're going to look specifically at some examples. I'm going to skip this slide because I think you can read it on your handout, and we're keeping the time in mind. So if we look specifically at some examples of what this Sesame Street effect might look like in my own research and some research that I've done with Mark Warschauer, we'll look at it in terms of multimedia only. So we're not going into blogs or wikis, we're just looking at multimedia here. Hybrid literacy texts, PowerPoint presentations, and digital storytelling are three. Hybrid literacy texts are ways to bridge what students do with popular culture and technology outside of school with what's going on within school. So in this case, the student was assigned to he could do a typical transformation activity where you transform from one genre to another. So take Beowulf, you're going to summarize it. Instead of summarizing Beowulf in the way that you would for a 5-paragraph essay to substantiate a point, the teacher said you can summarize Beowulf however you want. So the student chose to do a comic strip. And this was a language learner, so he basically offloaded the linguistic load by letting the story push through visually, and has some conventionalized elements here where he has the climax of the story is in the penultimate frame, and then it's released in the last. And he lets language do other things. Rather than push the story forward, he uses language to imbue Beowulf with a sense of humor. So here you've got Beowulf pulling off Grendel's arm and using it as a back scratcher. This would be a great back scratcher. And Beowulf is seen with this heroic flaw of saying, oh, I'm bored, we haven't had a war in so many years. So the student is able to capture some of that in something that's much more motivating for him. Now, of course, it begs the question, how prepared is the student going to be to write a summary of Beowulf when asked to? But at the very least, we have a language learner quite motivated, and an adolescent one quite motivated to work on some academic work. So it does not wash away some of the tensions there, but at least shows that there's a way to pull them in to help bridge them into academic work. PowerPoint presentations provide us something else to look at. So here we have two different examples. The blue slide, Outer Core, comes from a social studies presentation where they were supposed to be documenting certain vocabulary terms. So the title of this 10-page PowerPoint was Vocabulary Picture. And each of the slides was a different vocabulary word, from outer core to epicenter to fold and whatever. There was no categorization, there was no title, there was no synthesis, there was no oral presentation, and every student did the same PowerPoint presentation. Not the same one, but they did the same words, right? So it was nothing but another conventional activity. In this second one, which was also a social studies assignment, the student had to capture the story of Sacagawea and present it visually. So here you've got some English that looks pretty good, right? You've got an embedded noun clause in there. You've got an adjectival clause. Pretty transparent use of English. Well, whose writing is this? Same 2-week period as when Sylvia wrote her actual summary. So there's something going on here. Sylvia didn't write either of these. She just cut and pasted them. So what we find is that even though PowerPoint has a lot of potential to promote these broader skills that we're talking about in terms of ICT, like navigating a website, critically evaluating the website, synthesizing across websites, summarizing in your own words on that website, ESL students don't have much time to accomplish all of this, and their teachers have to be really supportive and know what to look for, to know how to help support them linguistically in order to accomplish all of these tasks. Not just to tell them to do it, but to know what it means to scaffold that on a turn-by-turn basis. And without that language specialization, it's going to be quite easy for students like Sylvia to impress us, because these PowerPoint presentations in a typical rubric are graded on clarity, correctness, and completion. 2 weeks after she did the Sacagawea project, I asked Sylvia to tell me something about Sacagawea, and she could not remember a single detail. So it begs the question just how students can sit and quietly do what they want to do, but they're needing support. And finally, in the interest of time, and since we don't have a sound connection, I'll tell you a little bit about the digital storytelling. But in this, we will see a couple of seconds of the actual movie because there's no sound to it. But in one of the attempts to help students engage more with literacy, since there's not much time within the school day, we started an action research project in which we brought together the ESL students to make digital movies. And in this particular case, the 6 of the girls in the project chose to do a collaborative project, and they were really rigorous with each other, and they would film the same clip multiple times, and they would critique it, and they would each sit down at a computer and create the graphics, and then they would vote on who had done the best graphic to insert into the movie. So it wasn't just a simple linear process for them. Neither was it really a writing activity, because they weren't actually writing anything. They were storyboarding and then orally talking about it. So there were these ways that the multimedia project could build on some of those literacies that we're talking about for the new century, like collaboration and creative problem solving, but bypassing some of the more traditional things like writing a script before you actually start to do your editing. So again, there's some tensions here. And in doing this, these are students who never stayed after school, and there's a real push to involve children from immigrant families in school functions, right? So suddenly they are not only asking the janitorial staff if they can borrow their clothing and borrow their tools so they can dress up, the level of detail here, but they also talk to the principal. They staged the assistant principal so that the assistant principal would run a meeting. They had the teachers dancing in the hallway. They were really engaging as participants in this school. So again, not exactly what's going to directly impact their academic scores, but something that you can imagine as an after-school project that pulls them in and helps them feel like members of the school community. And without the technology, I don't think if we had had a baking club, we would have necessarily brought them in. But when you keep that picture in mind, and the hybrid literacy text of Beowulf that I showed you, and the PowerPoint slides, and then remember the Sesame Street effect, I'm going to show you the last example, and then we're going to conclude, of a group of 3rd graders whose task was to help tutor their 2nd grade peers on the California statewide math exam. Now, often in such peer tutoring at the elementary level, you have these little scripted programs, and I'm the coach and you're the reader, and this is what I say, and this is what you say, and this is how I prompt you, which is great in a lot of cases. In this case, the students were doing this. They conducted their own research on the internet in groups to locate the California math standards. And then they developed, in groups, age and content-appropriate games to target selected math concepts. And then, embedded within this larger pedagogical project, they created their digital videos, which showed how to play the game, and they created multimedia instructional booklets to explain how to play the game. And at that point, they were allowed to go play with the 2nd graders. So this is the kind of ICT technology use. This is the kind of pedagogy that we're really pushing for in this next century. And yet, in order for this to take place, this took place in a high socioeconomic school. These were gifted and talented 3rd graders, and there is no reason why our English language learners cannot be doing this at the middle school and the secondary school level. So, to tie the two together, again, you can weigh in on the digital on your own. Can we tie these two frames together? So you're going to forgive me, I'll read a bit here because I want to capture this correctly. There are fears that these two frames are incompatible because we often assume the worst of each frame. In the conventional frame, for example, there are fears that students will be relegated to these interminable drills on a computer where they're isolated from other students and isolated from the mainstream curriculum, which often happens with the software programs that get adopted by districts. On the digital frame side, people are afraid that the visual and the multimodal will so gloss over more of the fundamental things that language learners really need to have built upon in schools that they'll never actually be able to catch up with their peers. They'll be relegated to doing projects like Laura's Angels instead of doing projects like a pedagogical search. So my suggestion is that in this question, the way to answer it now, as trite as the metaphor has become, we have to think of these two frames as on the same plane, as on a continuum. And that may seem like a baby step, but I do believe that this is a first step. So what are some of the things that need to happen in order for that to take place? First, we need more language specialists in second language education. In this push towards technology, whether you're in your own work more in a conventional frame or a digital frame, there's this fear that in that push, language learners will kind of be left by the wayside, still needing some support in basic skills. And by saying basic skills, I have to, I think, codify that because it's a very heated term. What I'm specifically referring to as basic skills in terms of language learners and their teachers are things like Sylvia, we'll return to her. Her social language fluency, both orally and in writing, provides a layer of a smoke screen that she can then get by with not being challenged to the same amount of academic work. Fortunately, school districts are doing a pretty good job now of helping bring teachers up to speed with fundamental principles of language learning like the BICS and CALP distinction, and they're learning to see through this smoke screen and provide support for learners like Sylvia. However, technology, as we saw through her PowerPoint presentation, and Laura's Angels, in which she was also a member, that's providing something of a second layer of a smoke screen. And I'm not so sure any of us, researchers and teachers alike, are all that savvy yet about what her real learning is going on underneath of that, because it's so easy to get carried away and excited about her engagement, her use of technology, her ability to grow so quickly with these skills. An example of basic issues in teacher preparation would be pointing back to the types of feedback that the teachers were giving the students in this technological forum. Again, these are not people trained in foreign language education. They've not had, they might have had some staff development, but they are transposing either what they're already doing face-to-face or they're grabbing at straws to find out how best to use this medium, which isn't even situated yet in a digital frame. It's still very conventional. We're basically talking about let's write back and forth. It's not asking for multimodality. It's not asking for them to learn new technologies. And yet we see that they're going to need a lot of mentoring to learn how to use technologies even at this level. Second, teachers and researchers, we need to understand and build on what students do with technologies outside of schools. Completely agree with that. But we also need to know what they're doing inside of schools, both with technology and without technology. Because when Larry Cuban talked about computers in the closet, you can walk into several laptop schools where students are provided with a computer one-on-one, and those laptops stay in the cases all day long. So even when there's this huge push to bring laptops into learning, there's very little support and very little actual activity happening in many places. So in this endeavor, to try to bridge the two, I'm definitely not alone. There have been repeated calls among researchers to make some of these bridges inside and outside of school. And as Glenda Hull has cautioned us, when we do that, we have to be careful not to romanticize youth culture and to look at everything they do as exciting and new, because they're very vulnerable to using prepackaged stereotypes and relying on a consumer culture to project themselves, when we need to be also teaching them to be critical consumers and taking what they already do and pushing them further with that instead of being in awe of what they do. We also have to be careful not to domesticate youth culture. In other words, it's ludicrous to think that we can take a digital story and measure it in the same way that we can measure writing fluency. We cannot co-opt ICT literacies and try to measure them with the same standardized tools that we've always used. So we're going to have a need for assessment tools that are strong and rigorous. And finally, and this is a call to myself and those of you in the room, we have to be inclusive in our work. We have to look to other types of researchers, and we have to be included in their work. We can't let ourselves be marginalized. We have to have literacy specialists on board. We have to have technology specialists on board. We need to look into cultural studies. We need to look into gender studies, look into rhetoric, and find out what we can do as teams to help bring these types of exciting new technologies into the schools to better serve our students. So, thank you for your time. We capped it to 50 minutes, but it's 4 o'clock, so if there are some, if anyone can stay for questions, then we're open. Oh, okay.